I'm Scarlett. I was never the girl who dreamed of weddings, not in white dresses, not in candlelight, not in forever. I never had a mother to whisper fairy tales into my ears, never saw her brush her hair in front of a mirror and hum about love. The only stories I grew up with were written in silence and soldier boots. My father raised me like a recruit. He taught me how to shoot before I learned how to dance. He told me love was a weakness and war was the only thing you could count on, so I counted on the weight of rifles and the sound of orders, not on promises, not on people. I went to war younger than I should have, and I stayed longer than most. I saw men fall with their eyes wide open. I saw friends forget their names from the noise. I forgot my own face for a while, not because I was hurt, but because I stopped looking. He came back with my body whole, but not much else. I walked down streets that once felt like mine, but now looked too clean to quiet. I sat in cafes where people laughed and held hands, and I could not understand why or how. They said I needed time. They said healing was not linear. They said I would love again, but I never had love in the first place. So how do you recover from a wound you never received? Edie stayed in base housing even after discharge. It felt safer, it felt neutral, it felt like I did not have to explain who I was or why I flinched at fireworks. And then one morning, between black coffee and cold toast, he showed up, not with a bang, not with charm, but with stillness, like he belonged there, like he was already a part of my life, and I had just forgotten. His name was Daniel, or at least that is what he said, and I did not question it, not yet. He said he used to serve, he said he understood. He said all the right things, but in a way that did not feel rehearsed. It felt real, and that was the problem, because I had spent years sharpening my distrust, years building walls that even I could not climb, and here he was slipping through a crack I did not know was there. He did not flirt, he did not push, he just stayed. A coffee on my porch, a morning run that turned into a silence that did not feel a QWERTY. Told myself I was not falling, that this was just curiosity, companionship at most. But my hand stopped trembling when he was near. My sleep was less violent, my shadows sat quieter in the corners of the room, never asked for more, never tried to touch me, never rushed, and I mistook that for love. I used to believe that people like me were not built for softness, that we were made of stone and steel and routines that did not allow for tenderness. But Daniel kept showing up, not in grand gestures, not with words, but with presence, and presence can be louder than anything. He learned the way I drank my coffee, the way I folded my shirts, the way I flinched when someone walked too close behind me. He never pointed it out, he never made me feel broken, he just adapted, and I began to confuse his adjustments with affection, with something close to safety. We spent evenings watching the sun sink into the edge of the horizon in silence, not touching, not talking, just existing side by side, and somehow that was enough for me, because I did not want fireworks, I wanted peace. And he gave me the illusion of it. I did not ask questions about his past. He said enough to keep me satisfied, stories of deployments, of mistakes, of old scars, and I believed him because I wanted to, because belief felt better than doubt, and I was tired of being at war even with my own mind. He started leaving things at my place, a book here, a jacket there, then drawers filled themselves with his things like vines creeping into walls, slow, quiet, irreversible, and I told myself this was what normal looked like. This was what people did when they cared for each other. I stopped counting the ways he fit into my world and started imagining a future that included him, and that terrified me because I had survived bullets and loss and silence. But I had never survived love, and I did not know if I could. Still, I let him in. I let him see me, not just the soldier, but the girl who missed having a mother, the woman who was tired of pretending she felt nothing, the shadow that sometimes sat too long in the dark. And he did not run, he stayed, and I mistook that for love again. It was not fast, it was not dramatic, it was not like the stories I had heard. It was slow, like fog creeping in, like a tide I did not notice until it had covered everything. And by the time I realized how far he had gone into my life, he was already inside every corner of it. We got married in a small courthouse, no guests, no flowers, just signatures and silence, and for the first time in a long time I felt like maybe I was not alone, maybe I had found something solid, something that would not disappear in the morning. But that feeling did not last long, because something began to shift, not in him but around him. Phone calls, he would not answer, trips, he would not explain money that seemed to vanish without reason, passwords that stopped working, mail I never saw at first. I thought I was being paranoid, that the old habits from war were clouding my trust, that I was inventing ghosts in places where there were none. But then I found the first real crack, a receipt for a hotel to towns over on a night he said he was with his brother, and just like that the piece shattered and all the noise came rushing back, the kind of noise only lies make when they unravel. Fast and cruel and loud, and I knew I had let something into my life that was never meant to stay. Daniel was not who he said he was, and I was not just hurt, I was humiliated, because I, a soldier, a fighter, a woman who had seen too much, had fallen for a mask and handed over my life without asking to see the face beneath it. Was the day I stopped being his wife and started becoming his consequence. I spent the next morning staring at that hotel receipt, not touching it, not moving, just staring. The numbers printed cleanly, the date, the time, the name that was not mine, and it felt like a fracture running straight through my chest, not deep enough to kill but wide enough to shift everything. G had seen betrayal in combat before, soldiers who abandoned posts, men who gave away coordinates to save themselves. I thought I had learned to recognize the scent of disloyalty, the way it crept into air, like something rotten and invisible. But with Daniel I had smelled nothing, only silence and warmth, and now the rot was everywhere. I did not confront him, I did not scream, I did not cry. I went quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes from training, from years of discipline, from knowing that emotion clouds vision, and vision is everything when you are preparing for worry. Started small, checking his phone when he showered, watching his eyes when I asked simple questions, noting the shift in his breathing, the way his fingers twitched when he lied, and he lied often, more than I had dared to imagine. There were messages hidden in apps, fake contact names, money transfers to names I did not recognize, photos of places I had never been and women I had never seen, and suddenly my home, my body, my name, all felt like they had been rented out to a stranger. He was careful, but not careful enough, not with someone like me, not with someone who had learned how to track enemy movement in desert wind, who had memorized maps with no roads, who could find patterns in smoke. I followed the trail like it was second nature, like it was what I was born to do. He had another life, a second apartment registered under a company name, a business that existed only on paper, and a woman younger than me with bright eyes and a ring just like mine. I watched her from my car parked across the street from their place, and I wondered if she had found the receipt too, if she had started unraveling. Yet it did not feel real, not the betrayal, not the woman, not the fact that I was the side story in my own life. He had taken my trust and built an entire fiction around it, and I had bought every line like it was gospel, because he knew how to wear sincerity like a uniform, and I had saluted it like a fool. Did not tell anyone, not my old unit, not the one friend I had kept from deployment. I carried it alone like I always had, because shame is quieter than anger, but it cuts deeper, and I was bleeding from places I could not name. And yet beneath the shame, beneath the ache, something began to move, not fear, not sadness, something harder, something sharper, something that had teeth. I had buried it long ago in the sand, in the blood, in the silence of barracks. But I remembered how to say, started taking notes, old school pen and paper, lines and circles, maps and photos, everything connected to Daniel, every lie, every name, every address. It felt like planning a mission, like preparing for recon. Only this time the target was my own husband and the battlefield was my Lefevre night. I laid in bed beside him, memorizing his breathing, thinking about the way he slept, like someone who had never worried about being watched, and it made me wonder how many people he had fooled before me, how many futures he had stolen with those hands that used to hold mine so carefully. But I was not like the others. I was not soft, I was not scared. I had survived too much, lost too much, seen too much, and if Daniel thought I would walk away quietly, then he never really knew me. At Ellie started with the simple things, passwords, old bank statements, printouts of everything I could find. I took photos of his ID, scanned documents when he was asleep, traced every digital footprint he left behind, not out of curiosity, not out of grief, but with precision, because this was no longer about heartbreak. This was reconnaissance. She had opened credit cards in my name, accounts I never approved, lines of debt that stretched into corners I did not know existed, and every number, every transaction, every false signature was a nail he had driven into the shell of the life I thought we had built together. He had stolen from me slowly, quietly, without bruises, without force, and that made it worse because I had let it happen, smiling, nodding, trusting, and now I would take it back, all of it, not just the money, but the control, the power. The narrative began collecting files on the woman he lived with, the second wife, or maybe third. Her name was Emily. She worked part-time at a clinic. She posted selfies with inspirational quotes, and her smile did not know it was a lie. I watched her for days, took photos of her routine, memorized the route she drove and where she liked to buy her coffee, not because I wanted to hurt her. I did not. I knew what she was. She was me 6 months ago. Full of belief and softness and illusions, but she was part of his web, and I needed to know everything about the web if I was going to tear it apart thread by thread. He bought a burner phone, paid in cash, created new accounts under a different name. The kind of anonymity I had learned during surveillance missions abroad, where identity was just a story and I was a good storyteller. When I had to use the new phone to set up alerts, to monitor his accounts, to speak to people who might have been victims too. I posed as a legal investigator, as an ex-girlfriend, as someone who had lost money and trust, and slowly stories poured in, too many to ignore. Daniel had done this before. Other names, other women, other lies, a pattern hidden beneath charm and clean shirts and fake thank yous. He had built a life on deception, a career on seduction, and I was just one in a long list of burned bridges. Only I was not burning quietly. Had chosen the wrong soldier. This team I went through my old contacts, people I had worked with overseas, people who owed me favors, not for violence, not for revenge, but for information, digital fingerprints, background checks, licenses, connections, and every hour brought me closer to the man behind the name, because Daniel was not his real name, and I finally knew if his real name was buried in a forgotten arrest record from a decade ago, tied to a different state, a different alias, and a scam that looked almost identical to mine, and yet he had slipped through the cracks, changed his skin, and started over again and again and again. He printed every file, placed them into folders marked in red, kept them in a locked drawer hidden under floorboards. I made copies, backups, flash drives, and cloud folders under coded names, because this was not emotion, this was strategy, and strategy does not leave loose ends. At night, I lay beside him, counting his breaths, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering how someone so still could carry so much rot. And every time he kissed my cheek, I smiled, not because I felt love, but because I knew what was coming. The day I would disappear, the day he would wake up and everything he had stolen would vanish with me, the day I would remind him that some ghosts fight back. The day I decided to disappear began like any other. There was coffee, bitter and hot, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the light crept through the blinds in soft, uneven lines. He kissed my cheek just like always, and I smiled just like always. But my bag was already packed, tucked away in the trunk of a car he did not know I owned. Nettie had been planning for weeks every piece of the escape, every contingency rehearsed in silence, in shadow, in the early morning hours when he slept too deeply to notice the flicker of screens or the quiet clicks of keys. I knew what time he left the house, what time he came back, when he answered calls and when he didn't. I had mapped out his rhythm like a sniper watching for breath. He liquidated my accounts, the ones he could not reach, cashed out old investments, closed credit cards, locked down my identity, every move covered, every exit prepared. The military had taught me how to vanish, and now I was using it not for survival but for justice. He left the envelope on the kitchen counter, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted him to see it, to feel the moment when control slipped through his hands. Inside were copies of everything, every fake document, every lie, every account, every photo, and a single sentence written in my hand: "You chose the wrong woman." He drove for hours, never the same direction, twice turned off my phone, left it in a dumpster behind a diner 3 states away. I had a new idea, new name, an old friend waiting at the edge of nowhere, a cabin stocked with food and silence and space to finish what I had started. From there, I watched everything unfold, not on television, not in headlines, but in transactions that froze, in accounts that triggered alerts, and messages he sent that bounced back unanswered. His world cracked, not all at once, but in sharp, deliberate fractures, and I smiled because this was mine, this was Ernetti. Sent the files to the authorities, to his other victims, to the woman he lived with, too. Her sister to her employer, not out of cruelty but out of clarity, because they deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered something they had built, even if it broke something they thought was real. Some of them reached out, some of them wept. Some of them screamed, and I let them because I had screamed too, only I had done it in silence in empty rooms with clenched fists and cold floors, and now it was their turn, not because I wanted them to hurt but because I wanted them to receive. Filed reports under his real name, flagged every tax record, every fraud alert, tied it all to his past and his present. I contacted private investigators, sent packages to news desks, made sure his face was seen in places he thought he was safe, because men like him survive on shadows, and I was flooding them with lies. Tried to call me, of course. The numbers came from unknown locations, from burner phones, but I never answered. I let them ring, let them die in the air, because I was no longer reachable. Not to him, not to the woman he pretended to love, not to the version of me that had believed any of it. Quiet was unfamiliar at first, too clean, too still, like the world had forgotten how loud betrayal was, but then the stillness became strength. I slept without watching the door, I ate without checking the locks, I looked in the mirror and saw something solid again, something that would not be moved. And in that stillness I started planning the final act, not a burst of vengeance, not a scream, not a bullet, but something deeper, something colder, something permanent, because Daniel had stolen more than money. He had tried to rewrite who I was, and I would not just erase him from my life, I would make sure he never did it again to any. And the first thing to collapse was his business, if you could even call it that. A shell company registered under false addresses, tied to names that belonged to the dead or the non-existent. The documents I sent were enough to trigger investigations, licenses suspended, accounts frozen, and suddenly the man who had controlled everything could not access anything. Then came the calls from people he had forgotten. The ones he scammed before me, old ghosts rising with new voices, demanding answers, demanding restitution, some legal, some not, and each of them chipping away at the image he had worked so hard to build, the polished liar, the charming husband, the trustworthy face, all of it crumbling one message at a time. I leaked stories anonymously to online forums, communities for fraud victims, threads where people traded scars and screenshots and receipts. His name began to show up again and again, shared by strangers who had never met but knew the shape of his betrayal like a common language. And suddenly he was not a man with secrets, he was a name with warnings flashing beside it. I traced one of his offshore accounts through a tip from a contact I had not spoken to in years, someone who still owed me for pulling him out of a firefight in a place the government pretended didn't exist. He gave me access not to the money but to the ledger, and with it I built a timeline, a narrative, a case. Gave everything to a journalist I trusted, a woman who had once reported from a war zone and knew what truth looked like when it was buried under lies. She verified every document, every voice note, every name, and when the story broke, it was not just an article, it was an explosion. Daniel, or whatever name he was using at that moment, lost everything in days, not because I yelled, not because I chased him with fire, but because I stripped away the mask slowly, carefully, until there was nothing left to hide behind, and the world saw him for what he was. Tried to run, I knew he would. People like him always do. He booked flights under a new alias, tried to move money, tried to erase tracks, but I was always one step ahead, not because I was smarter, but because I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. Authorities were already watching by the time he reached the airport, flagged and marked and waiting. He never made it past the gate, and I watched it unfold on a live stream meant for airline enthusiasts, a blurry image of a man in cuffs being led away, and even though it was grainy, I knew that posture, I knew that defeat. He did not celebrate, I did not cheer, there was no victory dance, no satisfaction, only a quiet breath, the kind you take after holding your lungs full of rage for too long and finally letting it go. It did not bring back what he stole, but it gave me something better. It gave me myself. I went back to the cabin, stayed off the grid, watched the news until his face faded from the headlines, until newer scandals replaced his, until the name Daniel became just another echo in the noise of the world, and only I remembered it for what it really meant, not pain it, betrayal, but proof that I was Not weak, that I could be broken and still rebuild, that I could be fooled and still fight back, that I could be used and still Rissia had chosen me because he thought I would stay silent because I wore softness like a scar and he mistook it for surrender, but I was never softy, was never his, and now he was no longer free. The silence after the storm is not peace, it is a space filled with echoes, echoes of choices made and bridges burned, the weight of victories won in shadow and the price paid in solitude. I lay in the cabin listening to the wind tapping at the windows, and wondered if this quiet was what I wanted or just what I deserved. Memories do not fade, they shift like shadows stretching longer at dusk, the faces of those I lost, the screams buried in desert dust, the nights spent awake counting heartbeats. Instead of stars, the absence of a mother, a void filled with questions no one ever answered. I thought I could outrun the past, leave it behind like footprints in sand, but some marks run deeper than skin and some ghosts follow you like old friends whose names you no longer remember but whose presence is unmistakable. I found myself staring into mirrors, searching for the girl who believed in justice, not revenge, the soldier who wore armor not to protect but to survive, the woman who could smile without the taste of bitterness on her tongue. The cabin became both refuge and prison, its walls holding stories I was not ready to tell yet, stories etched in scars on my skin and in the lines of my hands, stories of love lost and faith broken and a future rewritten in the ashes of yesterday. Walked the forests around the cabin, tracing paths I used to run during deployments, the quiet grounding me, reminding me that I was more than pain, more than betrayal, more than the lies that tried to define me. Night, I wrote letters to the mother I never knew, words poured out like a river unblocked by time or grief. I told her about the war, about the man who took my trust, and about the woman I was becoming, not one of sorrow but of strength. Did not know what came next, if forgiveness was possible or if the fire inside me would burn until there was nothing left but ash and resolve. I only knew that this was my story and I would write every line on my own terms. The past was a shadow, but it was also a teacher, and I was finally ready to learn. Nights are the hardest when the silence grows too loud, when memories rush back like tides pulling me under. I lie awake, tracing the lines on my hands, wondering if these marks will ever fade or if they are the map of who I am, the soldier, the daughter, the woman betrayed and reborn. Sometimes I see her face, the mother I never knew, the woman I wish had held me through the storms, the one whose absence shaped every choice, every fear, every crack in my armor. I speak to her in the dark, whispering promises I could never keep, and I wonder if she hears. Love is a language I am still learning, one that I mistranslated for years, confusing it with control, with silence, with absence, with pain. But now I am beginning to understand that love is not weakness, it is not a chain, but a kind of strength that allows you to stand even when everything is falling apart. A dream of a future not defined by scars or lies but by the quiet moments, the small victories, the laughter that slips through cracks like sunlight through broken glass, a future where I am more than the sum of my past, where I can be free. War taught me to fight, but it did not teach me how to heal. It showed me how to survive but not how to live fully, and now I'm learning those lessons slowly, painfully, with patience, with hope, with the weight of everything I have lost and everything I have gained. I am not the woman I was before, but I am not the woman I feared I would become. I am a mosaic of broken pieces, and unbroken while a story still unfolding, and I am ready for whatever comes next. I woke to the first light spilling through cracked blinds, a new day, a new chance to redefine what life meant to me. The weight of yesterday still there but lighter, softer, like the difference between a storm and a drizzly. Cabin felt less like a prison, more like a promise, a place where I could start again, piece by piece, rebuild the fragments of a future I thought was lost. I planted seeds of hope in the soil of my pain, knowing that not everything would bloom but some things mighty. Took long walks through forests that had witnessed both my fears and my courage. The trees stood tall, indifferent to the past, whispering secrets only those who listened could hear, and I listened. Found joy in small things, the taste of cold water after a run, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the steady beat of my own heart, reminding me I was alive and capable of more than survival. Some days I caught myself smiling without reason or guard, a softness creeping into my voice, a lightness in my step That surprised even me. It was unfamiliar and welcome, but the past was never far behind. It lingered in the rustle of leaves and the creak of floorboards, in the shadow of a man who was not really there but whose presence haunted stilly. New healing was not linear, that scars would fade but memories might never disappear, and I was learning to carry them not as burdens but as proof of resilience, proof of battles fought and won, even if silent life future was uncertain, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I could choose if days grew longer, and so did the shadows. They stretched across the cabin floor, reminders that even in light darkness waits patiently. I met new faces, some cautious, others kind, each encounter a test, a step toward letting someone in again. Trust was a fortress I kept guarded with layers of walls built from years of betrayal and loss, yet slowly cracks appeared, not from weakness but from the steady drip of patience and understanding that seeped through. I found myself laughing at things that had nothing to do with pain or survival, genuine laughter that startled me with its warmth and honesty. It was a sound I thought I had forgotten how to make. There were moments when fear whispered close, when the ghost of Daniel flickered in my mind, a shadow threatening to undo the progress I had made, but I pushed back harder every time, reminding myself that I was no longer his prisoner. Love remained a mystery, an unfinished map. I was still learning to navigate its twists and turns, but I was willing to try, willing to believe that maybe this time it would be different, that maybe softness did not mean surrender. I wrote more letters to the mother I never knew, pouring out hope, pain, and questions, hoping to find answers in words that belonged to someone I never met. The process was messy, imperfect, but it was mine, and that mattered. Some days I caught myself staring out the window, imagining a future where scars were just stories told, not wounds that ached, and I knew that healing was a journey, not a destination, and I was ready to walk it. Past would always be part of me, but it would no longer define me. I was more than my pain, more than my mistakes, more than the man who tried to break me. I was Scarlett, and I was becoming whole again. The quiet I had fought for felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The past was never far. It lurked in the corners of my new life, waiting for a chance to strike or to remind me that safety was an illusion. New faces appeared, strangers with questions veiled, threats hidden in smiles, and offers that seemed too good to be true. I sensed the tension before it fully arrived, the way you do when you have lived through too many battles and learned to read the silence between words. He sharpened my senses the way I had in the field. Every sound, every movement, every shadow became a signal, a warning, a call to action. I was no longer just surviving, I was defending not just myself but the fragile peace I had earned with sweat and scars. There were nights I woke with my heart racing, the remnants of old fears mixing with new ones, the past clawing at the edges of my mind, reminding me that some wars are fought not on battlefields but in boardrooms and quiet streets, in the spaces between trust and betrayal. Made alliances cautiously, people who understood loyalty and discretion, those who valued truth over convenience. I rebuilt my network not for power but for protection, a silent army ready to guard the lines I had drawn around my life. The threats came in whispers, threats of exposure, of lies, unraveling carefully constructed facades. I countered them with facts, with patience, with the quiet strength that only time and pain can forge. I was no longer the prey but the hunter, and in that role I found a new kind of freedom, freedom born from control, from clarity, from the knowledge that no one could touch what I refused to lose. The past was a scar, but it was also a shield, and I wielded it well. Threats no longer whispered, they came crashing like waves breaking through defenses. I watched as my carefully built walls trembled under pressure, and I realized that surviving meant adapting faster than the stormy, called on contacts old and new, weaving a web of information and influence that stretched across cities, states, and borders. My mind became a battlefield where strategies unfolded like maps, and each move was calculated with precision. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of years and wounds whispered that maybe this fight was endless, that some ghosts could not be chased away, but I pushed those thoughts aside, reminding myself that strength is not the absence of fear but the will to keep standing. Man, from my past surfaced again with his lies, with his threats, with his attempts to reclaim what he thought was his. I met him not with anger, but with cold resolve, a soldier ready for battle, no longer the prey, but the predatory. Gathered evidence, documents, recordings, testimonies, a silent dossier that could topple empires, or at least the small kingdom he had tried to build on broken trust. I prepared for every scenario, every trap, every shadow that could be cast in my path. At times, the loneliness was overwhelming, the kind that seeps into bones and whispers that no one truly understands. But I was no stranger to solitude. I had made peace with it, found strength in the quiet corners of my mind, and learned that even warriors need moments of stillness. And when the final confrontation came, it was not a clash of guns or screams, but a quiet unraveling, a dismantling of lies piece by piece, and I stood firm, watching as the man who once held my life in his hands was reduced to nothing more than a ghost. In the wind, the fight was far from over, but I had reclaimed my story, rewritten the narrative, and found power in the ashes of betrayal. The air was different now, lighter, almost like the weight of years had finally lifted from my shoulders. I woke without the heaviness of dread or anger, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. The scars were still there, etched deep, but they no longer defined my walked through the world with a new kind of certainty, the kind that comes not from control but from acceptance, from knowing that the past is a chapter, not the whole story. I had survived betrayals, losses, and wars, and now I was ready to write what came next. Freedom was not a loud proclamation, it was a silent choice, a moment each day to breathe without fear, to smile without suspicion, to love without hesitation, though that last one was still a journey, not a destination. I visited places I had once avoided, the forest trails, the small towns, the faces that reminded me of both pain and hope. I carried them all like a map, guiding me forward, teaching me that strength comes from embracing every piece of yourself, even the broken parts. There were mornings when the sun warmed my skin and I felt like a soldier at peace, not because the battles were over, but because I had made peace with the fight within me. I was no longer running from ghosts, but walking beside them as a quality, found new purpose in quiet things, the touch of wind on my face, the sound of rain on the roof, the rhythm of my own heartbeat, steady and sure, reminding me that life was mine to live, not to survive. And in that life I was free to choose, free to heal, free to become someone I never thought I could be, someone whole and unafraid. He stood at the edge of the lake, the water still and clear, reflecting the sky above, a mirror for the soul, a place where I could leave behind the weight of the past and step into the light of what was to come. I breathed in the cold air, felt it fill my lungs, and knew that this moment was minute. Years of pain, the nights of doubt, the battles fought both within and without had shaped me, but they did not define me. I was more than the sum of scars, more than the echo of lies, more than the shadow of a man who tried to break my thought about the woman I had been, the soldier, the daughter, the lover, the fighter who had learned to lose and to rise again with every fall. I honored every part of her, even the broken pieces, because they were proof of a life lived fully, a story told without apologizing. Future stretched before me like an open road, uncertain yet inviting, full of possibilities. I did not know where it would lead, but I was ready to walk it step by step with courage and with grace. Love was no longer a battlefield, it was a garden, a place where I could plant seeds of hope and nurture them with patience and care. I was ready to open my heart again, not because I had forgotten the past, but because I had learned how to carry it with strength. He turned away from the lake and walked back to the cabin, to the life I had rebuilt, the life I had earned, the life that was mine. And as the sun set behind the trees, I smiled, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready. Thanks for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to follow and subscribe for more stories.